כיף להיות פה בישראל, תמיד, ובאילת. Because my friends and colleagues, John and Nancy are here, I'm going to do it in English. You can take the headsets off. You see how good we are in Israel? Guy, thank you for the introduction. I think it was very inclusive, and I actually think that a lot of the things that you spoke about were very much aligned. And by the way, if somebody doesn't understand me, just stop me and I'll explain. When we talk about, or when we think about towers, we talk about a lot of the physical aspects that make a tower. How structurally it stands, only held at the bottom, and how slender it is, the proportion between its footprint and its height. We talk about its shape. People say that towers is swiveling, it's twisting, it's tilting, it's zigzagging. We talk about the way that it hits the skyline. Right? We talk about the facade, is it glass, is it masonry, how sustainable it is, or how efficient the tower is. But I think we talk less about the fact that modern towers in modern cities today house hundreds and sometimes thousands of people in one kind of container. So when you think about thousands of people, equivalent might be a performance center, right, or a stadium, or a neighborhood. Most of the neighborhoods here in Israel and everywhere in the world consist of sort of a social fabric of a few hundred people, maybe 2,000 or 3,000, that contain a neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, when we speak about that, we speak about totally different things. We speak about the open space, about the permeability, the amount of open space that exists between buildings. We speak about activation of the streets, retail, mobility. Everybody talks about mobility now, like how far I'm walking distance from, shopping centers or work, etc. So how come we don't speak about towers in the same language that we speak about neighborhoods? And that's the topic that you started touching. And what I want to do, because we have a short time, is basically share with you how we at our office in New York at Beniya, how we start treating towers in language or vocabulary that has to do with neighborhoods. Because the reality is, guys, that the next generations of towers, and we're all going to live within towers in downtown cities, will act and feel more like a neighborhood. I want to touch on five topics: porosity, mobility, community, scalability, and contextuality, and I'll explain one by one. Porosity, avriliyut, is the asset we talk about when we talk about urbanism, the gaps and the balance between open space and built environment. That's the porosity, right? And I just want to show a small example of a tower we're doing in New York City. It's one of those cylinder towers. We know that this is a new phenomenon in New York, a very small footprint. The developer buy the air rights and expand this to the end. And when we were commissioned to design one of those next to the UN on 41st Street, we thought, what would happen if we extend the tower beyond its program? Meaning that the program has X amount of floor area, and if we expand it beyond, we literally create gaps in the building. And why would we do that? Well, the gaps becomes, if you will, gardens that are equivalent to backyard or front yard. If you think of Tel Aviv is interesting because it has buildings and gaps, right? Think of this tower as Tel Aviv assembled vertically, or a neighborhood of private homes, if you will, where every house has a garden at the front or at the back. These are down yards or up yards for single apartments. These are protected, open space from the wind because they're contained within the footprint of the building. They're tall enough to allow lights to come in and infiltrate deep into the garden, so you can actually plant and have natural light. And it brings a totally new type of garden, a totally new type of porosity within building that allows for views as well as outdoor space. And essentially we can start discussing the element of porosity as an attribute that we see the future or the modern towers as an expression in relationship to the old, maybe Art Deco, Art Nouveau buildings Which leads me into mobility. Everybody talks about the walkable cities today. I know that in Israel it's a big topic. Can I live in Tzfon Tel Aviv and just walk to the shopping center, or just walk to the kindergarten, or just walk to even my office? With the situation in Israel where you can't get into a car without, burning 3 hours, walkability is a major thing, and it's a major thing throughout the world. But mobility doesn't stop at the city scale. We should ask ourselves, what is the mobility within our towers? I want to give you an example of a building we designed in San Francisco. And San Francisco is a city where downtown, as you know it, is predominantly office or commercial, where the residential neighborhoods are at the perimeter or the surroundings. And we were asked to design a building right at the meeting point between the two. If you know the city, this is Market Street that leads you all the way to downtown the water, and Venice is a street that crosses right and left where City Hall is. And essentially, the site is located between those kind of iconic elements of San Francisco. The Golden Gate Bridge, downtown, and the Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is two of these hills that has a lot of residential neighborhoods around them. And so we thought, we're going to build a tower that is about 1.2 million square feet, or 1,200 apartments, 1,200 dirot. This is about, 2,000 people or more? And if you compare them to a traditional neighborhood and you take those people and stack them in a vertical structure, two things happen. First of all of these urban amenities that we talk about, walking to the kindergarten, walking to the dog run, walking to the hair salon, they're not usually finding home in our vertical towers. And also the democratic way by which we walk around our neighborhoods now becomes an entrance to a lobby and a dead-end corridor through an elevator. Because our footprint was big enough, we started thinking about two towers in the shape of an L that overlap, one on top of the other. And we started shaping them in a way that would create very unique experiences in between as the tower grows vertically. You see the bridge at the bottom and the arch at the top. We kind of laugh about the fact that it's a bit of a Twin Peaks above the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, since we have two cores, we could connect throughout the tower in different areas. We can connect some of those urban amenities that you find in a neighborhood. We can bring them back. We can bring back the community garden. We can bring back the retail at the ground floor, but also in other floors as well. We have commercial, we have office spaces, we have a WeWork space. We have all of those elements that you might find in a neighborhood, and the mobility within the building is more democratic. One can kind of generate their own path throughout the tower. And essentially, as it comes together, it becomes a major symbol, potentially of sort of a new way of living within an intense, densified city. This tower is in the final approval process, and hopefully we're going to get it done soon. Community. Well, everybody talks about community. How do you say community in Hebrew when you talk about community? Kehila. Kehila? This is like everybody says kehilot. We have to build a kehila. We have to build a community. But how do we build a community? Through architecture. We create the platform by which people can meet in a natural way without a commitment, so they can interact in a smaller scale. This is what kehila is about. And kehilot are basically part of what neighbors are. And clearly we all know that we put gyms and lounges and swimming pools even in our towers. But maybe beyond the function, what we call like a Chinese menu of functions, we should start thinking of how we mold those places in a unique way. And I want to show a tower we're doing in Seattle. And Seattle, if you don't know, is a city that is surrounded by beautiful landscape and nature. Mount Rainier is one of them. The Puget Sound. And we thought, can we really create an elevated park within the tower as a community place, as a park kehilati? We were inspired by the shape of Mount Rainier and the fact that we'll be able to kind of look into the mountain. And so think about it, there's a big gap in the tower that then grew to about 60 feet tall, which is about 20 meters in height. The footprint is quite large because it's a big tower, so it's about 30 meters by 60 meters. That's like a small park. And it houses some of those amenities, and it all comes together and framed by this mega structure that also takes care of offsetting some of the columns to the corner. And essentially, this item in the sky, this one thing, which is the park in the sky that serves this community, becomes the visual architectural elements that unite or unify the language of this entire tower, and brings the idea of community to a language of architecture that might be a little different, and the experience of that being in a community garden, looking at this beautiful landscape framing by sort of the structure of the tower, might be a unique experience. Just bring me to LA, and in a similar method, LA is a city that is very spread. Downtown is becoming extensive and very desirable for people to live in. It's more walkable. But if you look at those towers, most of them, the commercial towers, are quite generic. We see those everywhere in the world. The residential towers are pretty generic as well. And are only one idea, because listen, we have great ideas as architects, but developers at the end of the day needs to pay for them. So I'm all for taking one strong idea. Our only idea in this building was to take all of the community life of these 2,500 people who are going to live here and design a community center. How would you call it? Merkaz Kihilati. A community center in the middle of the tower. And that community center would house many of the aspects that you might find in a neighborhood, including a pool that is about 450 feet in the air, and gardens and gyms, etc. And that element now is translated to an architectural language that expresses the new idea, and it also serves all of the people within the building itself. And then the base of the tower and the way that it meets the street talks about the same idea, but in a different type of community. This is for the bigger neighborhood as a gathering space. So now you've got the corner plaza surrounded by the retail at the ground, at the street level, and then the community center at the neighborhood itself, about 500 feet in the air. Scale. I want to show a building in Toronto. Toronto is a city that has grown tremendously in the past decade. Some people would say too fast. A lot of generic towers are popping out in downtown city, but the funny thing about it is the overlap of what Toronto's city looks like and Lake Ontario. Like the city without the lake looks like any other generic city in the world, and the lake without the city looks like the Bahamas. But there's really a disconnect between the two. Part of it is because scalability. The scale of the building does not communicate the beauty of living on the lake front. And we were challenged to build a very vertical structure that houses about 400 units. 400 units in the neighborhoods around looks like this. And we were again talking about the idea of a unit with a garden, and how we can break the scale. And essentially what we've done is a very simple L-shaped building. You know, in an L, you've got apartments on both sides of the corridors. Then they're twisted 45 degrees to create living rooms that have corner to the view and break the scale. Then they're shifted every floor to create a terrace. So every one of those units has a 12 by 12 terrace. And then we give it a little twist to the right in order to maximize the views of all tenants. So I just want to point out the difference between a linear balcony, which is very common in Toronto, to a terrace, which is an external room for the apartment. Israel is actually quite good at that. Not so much New York. And so one might argue that this new tower, if you will, is a series of private homes or a community with a balance of privacy and open space, with an interactive garden. Some of them are communal, by the way, and some of them are private. And the amount of green space that is brought back by the building exceeds the footprint of the building by almost 4, because of the overlap of the green spaces themselves. Which brings me back to New York City. It's a tower on Nassau Street downtown, which, God help me, I hope is going to start construction. The market in New York is horrible and people are afraid to start new projects, which is a time to build here in Tel Aviv. This tower in downtown Manhattan is sitting around many commercial towers, as we all know them. They're pretty much extrusion of either stone or glass. And the idea of scalability or expressing the scale, human scale, came through basically deduction, where we're creating different floor plates. Each one has 2 bedrooms in the corner with a garden, and as they kind of exceed themselves, they basically kind of overlap themselves. They create the gesture. And then clearly the units have corner views and outdoor terraces, and then the penthouses are set back from the screen to create protection from outside wing and create an indoor-outdoor experience. And some of the communal spaces, the communities, do the same thing. They connect inside and outside in the best way. I'm going to run quickly before they kick me out. Contextuality is one of the biggest questions that we are struggling with, because we create more and more generic buildings around the world that look exactly the same. And maybe it's fine. Maybe this is the generation of sameness. Or maybe we should be a little bit more thoughtful about our process of design. I want to show you a project I'm very proud of in Rotterdam. This is a competition we won, international competition we won about 2.5 years ago. Rotterdam was bombed to the ground in World War II. As you know, it has 3 buildings that remain: the City Hall, the Post Office building, and the World Trade Center. Post Office was such an important aspect back then, and the connection to the world. And the city wanted to revive that building. It has been empty for 12 years, and conducted a competition to design a tower on top of it. And the building itself is quite stunning, but it's what I call a dead-end kind of auditorium building. You come in from the front door, there's this amazing hall, and then you go out. But we thought that the building, the way it lends, could connect different fabrics in the city that exist right now but are disconnected, and perhaps we can open up the backside, which used to be the loading dock, and make it a courtyard that connects to the front, and bring people through it with mixed use, as you see on the left, of retail and hospitality and office and residential, and then land the tower on this mega structure that would allow that connection to happen at the ground floor and create this duality between old and new. And as the tower lands, it's dramatically inspired by the historical building, but doesn't imitate it. And you can see that the sort of the scalability, the context, some of the materiality and everything, as it kind of stretches up in proportion, creates a language of porosity, a language of scalability, of human scale, of open gardens, of communal spaces at the center. And it's all inspired by the proportion of this existing building, and hopefully can do some good to the world by confusing wind, reducing the amount of drift at the street level, and collecting rainwater and using them as gray water. And I'd like to hope that this building can only and will only be constructed in Rotterdam in that context, with that building, and nowhere else in the world. And just to take you kind of a walkthrough around, this is the Main Street Poolsingale. By the way, the preservation of the landmark committees, both in the city and state, resented this project tremendously. מחלקת השימור של תל אביב לא הייתה מאשרת אולי הבנייה של גל, הבניין היסטורי. But I think we've managed to convince that the qualities that are created that benefits the city through density, bring people and mixed use into the street level, would be highly beneficial to the city itself, and create those community or communal spaces in such a beautiful scale. Embrace the history of the building through preservation and create new typology for the future. Here's the new courtyard. Both of them are connected. The mega structure that holds the tower. The building was approved after 2 years of delegation, or literally kind of a very hectic process. And we're very proud to tell you that it's going into construction. Thank you very much.